In the darkness of the Mediterranean Sea, three men made a decision that would haunt them forever. They thought Sarah Martinez was just another naive American tourist who had stumbled upon their operation. They thought throwing her overboard would silence her permanently. They thought the ocean would hide their crime. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that Sarah Martinez wasn't just any tourist. She was the daughter of a decorated Navy SEAL, trained in survival tactics since childhood. And when word reached her father's former unit about what happened to her, they didn't just call the authorities. They called in every favor. They activated every connection. They prepared for a mission that wasn't sanctioned by any government, but was driven by something far more powerful than military orders: the unbreakable bond between warriors and family. This is the story of betrayal, survival, and justice served by those who never leave anyone behind. This is the story of how three criminals learned that some people have protectors who will cross oceans and break laws to balance the scales. The ocean kept Sarah's secret for 3 days. But it couldn't keep Sarah. Martinez had always been drawn to adventure, but her trip to the Greek islands was supposed to be simple. At 28, she worked as a marine biology researcher in San Diego, and this Mediterranean expedition was her first real vacation in 3 years. Her father, Command Master Chief Daniel Martinez, had retired from the Navy SEALs 2 years earlier, and he'd been pushing her to take time off from her demanding research schedule. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd chosen to vacation near the sea. Growing up as the daughter of a SEAL meant that water had been her playground since childhood. Daniel had taught her to swim before she could properly walk, and by age 10, she could hold her breath underwater longer than most adults. Those skills felt like childhood games back then. She never imagined they would one day save her life. Sarah had booked a week-long sailing tour through the lesser-known islands between Crete and Rhodes. The tour company, Aegean Adventures, marketed itself to tourists seeking authentic experiences away from crowded cruise ship routes. The boat, a 40-foot catamaran named Poseidon's Dream, was skippered by Captain Andreas Nicolaou, a weathered Greek man in his 50s who claimed 40 years of sailing experience in these waters. What attracted Sarah to this particular tour wasn't just the promise of pristine diving spots and secluded beaches. Andreas had emphasized that they would visit locations where ancient trade routes once flourished, places where archaeological treasures still occasionally surfaced. As a scientist, Sarah was fascinated by the intersection of marine life and human history. The other passengers seemed pleasant enough when they met at the marina in Rhodes. There was Elena Rossetti, an Italian art historian in her 40s researching Byzantine coastal settlements, and Marcus and Linda Thompson, a retired British couple who ran a small yacht charter business back in Cornwall. The group dynamic felt comfortable and academic rather than party-focused, which suited Sarah perfectly. For the first 2 days, everything exceeded her expectations. They anchored near tiny, uninhabited islands where Sarah could dive among underwater rock formations teeming with sea life she'd only seen in textbooks. Andreas proved to be an excellent guide, pointing out subtle changes in watercolor that indicated underwater caves and explaining the local legends associated with each location. Elena turned out to be fascinating company, sharing stories about medieval maritime trade while they sat on deck in the evenings. The Thompsons were experienced sailors themselves and helped with boat maintenance, creating an atmosphere of shared adventure rather than passive tourism. But on the third morning, Sarah noticed something that didn't fit. They had anchored near a small rocky outcrop called Agios Stefanos, barely more than a large stone rising from the sea with a few struggling olive trees clinging to its surface. Andreas had described it as their most remote stop, a place where they could experience complete solitude. What he hadn't mentioned was that they wouldn't actually be alone. Sarah was up before dawn, as was her habit. She enjoyed watching the sunrise from the water, and the morning swim had become her daily ritual. As she prepared to dive from the stern, she noticed a small speedboat approaching from the north. At first, she assumed it was local fishermen, common in these waters. But as the boat drew closer, several things struck her as odd. The boat was moving too fast and too directly toward their location to be engaged in fishing. It was also an expensive-looking vessel, far too sleek and powerful for typical fishing activities. Most importantly, when she looked through the boat's small binoculars, She could see that the men aboard were not dressed like fishermen and carried no visible fishing equipment. Instead of announcing the approaching boat to the others, Sarah decided to observe quietly. Something about the situation triggered instincts her father had drilled into her since childhood. When something feels wrong, gather information before acting. She positioned herself behind the boat's small dinghy, using it as cover while watching the speedboat approach. What she witnessed over the next hour would change everything. The speedboat crew consisted of 3 men who clearly knew Andreas well. They spoke in rapid Greek, too fast for Sarah's limited language skills, but their body language suggested a business relationship rather than a casual encounter. More troubling was what they transferred from their boat to the catamaran. Using a small crane mounted on the speedboat, they lifted several heavy, waterproof containers onto Poseidon's Dream. The containers were roughly the size of large suitcases, but seemed to require careful handling. Andreas directed them to store the containers in the catamaran's forward compartment, an area that had been locked throughout the trip and described to passengers as containing safety equipment. What made Sarah's stomach tighten was the behavior of the speedboat crew. These weren't casual smugglers moving contraband tobacco or avoiding tourist taxes. These men moved with military precision and carried themselves like professionals engaged in serious criminal activity. When one of them briefly removed his jacket, Sarah could see a shoulder holster. The transfer took less than 30 minutes, but during that time, Sarah observed enough to know she had stumbled onto something dangerous. The containers were marked with symbols she didn't recognize, but they were clearly not standard marine equipment. The careful handling suggested either extreme value or extreme danger, possibly both. As the speedboat prepared to leave, one of the men pointed directly toward the stern where Sarah was hiding. Her heart stopped as she realized she might have been spotted, but after a brief exchange with Andreas, the men departed without investigating further. Sarah remained hidden for another 10 minutes after the speedboat disappeared, trying to process what she had witnessed. Her father's training echoed in her mind. In dangerous situations, information is power, but knowledge can also be a liability. She now possessed information that someone had gone to considerable effort to keep secret. When she finally emerged from hiding, Andreas was standing on deck, but his demeanor had changed completely. The friendly tour guide was gone, replaced by someone scanning the horizon with obvious tension. When he spotted Sarah, his expression shifted through surprise, calculation, and what looked like resignation. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, his accent somehow thicker than it had been the day before. "You are up very early." "I like to watch the sunrise," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Beautiful morning for sailing." Andreas studied her face carefully, and Sarah felt like she was being evaluated. "Yes, very beautiful. Perhaps today we should move to a different location. This area can become busy." The way he emphasized the word busy sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It was a warning disguised as a casual comment, and they both knew it. "That sounds good," Sarah replied. "I'll go wake the others." As she walked toward the cabin, Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could pretend she had seen nothing and hope to complete the tour without incident. She could confront Andreas directly and demand an explanation. Or she could find a way to gather more information while planning her next move. What she couldn't do was contact her father or any authorities. They were days away from the nearest port, completely dependent on Andreas for their safety and survival. She was trapped on a boat with someone involved in serious criminal activity, surrounded by miles of open ocean. But Sarah Martinez was her father's daughter, and Command Master Chief Daniel Martinez had not raised a quitter. If she was going to be trapped in this situation, she would be trapped with her eyes open and her options ready. As she reached for the cabin door, she heard Andreas speaking quietly into a radio in rapid Greek. She couldn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone. He was reporting to someone, and she had the sinking feeling that she was the subject of that report. The vacation was over. Now it was about survival. What Sarah didn't know was that Andreas wasn't just a tour boat. The atmosphere aboard Poseidon's Dream had shifted dramatically by midday. Where there had once been easy conversation and shared meals, now there was tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Andreas moved around the boat with nervous energy, constantly checking his radio and scanning the horizon. Elena, Marcus, and Linda seemed oblivious to the change, chatting about their planned afternoon exploration of a small island Andreas had promised would offer excellent snorkeling. Sarah found herself in an impossible position. Every instinct her father had taught her screamed that she was in immediate danger, but she was trapped on a boat with innocent people who had no idea what was happening. Warning them might trigger a confrontation that could get everyone killed. Staying silent might mean missing her only chance to escape whatever Andreas was planning. As the boat moved steadily eastward, farther from any shipping lanes or coastal patrols, Sarah noticed that their route had changed dramatically from the original itinerary. They were heading toward waters that appeared completely empty on the navigation charts visible from the pilot station. When she casually asked Andreas about their destination, his answer was vague and uncomfortable. "There is a special place I want to show you all," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Very private, very beautiful, perfect for swimming." The way he emphasized perfect for swimming made Sarah's blood run cold. She recognized the tone from her father's stories about hostile interrogations. Andreas was sending a message meant specifically for her, letting her know that he was aware of what she had seen and was making plans accordingly. Sarah spent the afternoon subtly observing the other passengers, trying to determine if any of them might be more than they appeared. Elena seemed genuinely absorbed in her historical research, constantly taking notes and photographing coastal features. The Thompsons were clearly experienced sailors, but showed no signs of being anything other than retired adventurers. If Andreas had allies among the passengers, they were playing their parts perfectly. As evening approached, Andreas announced that they would anchor for the night in a secluded bay he described as one of his favorite spots. When Sarah looked at the location on the navigation charts, she felt her heart sink. They were now more than 40 miles from the nearest inhabited island, in waters too deep for most recreational diving and too remote for regular patrol boats. It was the perfect place for someone to disappear. During dinner, Sarah made a decision that would either save her life or seal her fate. She began documenting everything she had observed, using her phone to take seemingly casual photos that actually captured details of the boat's equipment, the locked forward compartment, and, most importantly, Andreas himself. She also composed a detailed message describing the morning's events, but rather than sending it immediately, she saved it as a draft. Her father had taught her that in dangerous situations, communication was everything, but timing was crucial. Send information too early, and you might trigger the very response you're trying to avoid. Wait too long, and you might never get the chance to send it at all. As the sun set, and the other passengers settled in for the evening, Sarah noticed that Andreas had begun making frequent trips to the locked forward compartment. Each time he emerged, he seemed more agitated. Whatever was in those containers was driving his decision-making, and Sarah suspected that whatever schedule he was operating under was accelerating. Her suspicions were confirmed when Andreas approached her around 10 o'clock, as she sat alone on deck pretending to stargaze. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying none of its previous warmth. "Tomorrow we will reach our final destination. It would be best if you stayed close to the boat. These waters can be dangerous for swimming." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat delivered with the thin veneer of concern, and they both knew it. "Of course," Sarah replied, matching his false casual tone. "I wouldn't want to take any unnecessary risks." Andreas studied her face in the moonlight, clearly trying to determine how much she understood about their situation. "You are a smart woman, Sarah. Smarter than most tourists. Sometimes being too smart can be a problem." The mask was slipping. Andreas was no longer pretending to be just a tour boat captain, and Sarah realized that they had moved past the point where either of them could maintain their pretenses. The question now was whether he planned to act tonight or wait until they reached whatever destination he had in mind. "Intelligence is only a problem if it's used unwisely," Sarah replied carefully. "I'm just here to enjoy my vacation and see some beautiful places." Andreas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Yes, beautiful places. Tomorrow you will see a very special place. Very remote. Very private. The kind of place where a person could disappear completely." The threat was now explicit. Andreas wanted her to know that he was in complete control, and that her life hung entirely on his decisions. What he didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had been prepared for exactly this type of situation since childhood. While her friends in college had been learning to handle social drama and academic pressure, Sarah had been learning to handle life-or-death situations. Her father's training had covered everything from escape and evasion to underwater survival to improvised weapons. Most importantly, he had taught her that the moment someone threatens you, you are already in a fight for your life, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. After Andreas returned to the pilot station, Sarah made her move. She activated her phone's GPS sharing function and sent her location to 3 people: her father, her best friend Jennifer in San Diego, and her supervisor at the Marine Research Institute. The message she sent was simple but clear: having amazing time, but boat route has changed. If you don't hear from me by Tuesday, contact Coast Guard. Love you all. It was coded language her father would recognize immediately. Amazing time was their family code for danger, established when she was a teenager and used whenever she needed help but couldn't speak freely. The mention of Coast Guard involvement would tell him that she was dealing with something beyond ordinary trouble. More importantly, by sharing her GPS location, she was creating a digital trail that would lead investigators directly to their current position. Even if something happened to her, there would be evidence pointing to this exact location. Sarah also activated every security feature on her phone, from remote wiping capabilities to automatic cloud backup of her photos and messages. If Andreas discovered the device and tried to destroy it, the evidence would already be safely stored elsewhere. With her digital insurance policy in place, Sarah turned her attention to physical preparation. She quietly gathered items that could serve as improvised weapons or survival tools: a small diving knife from her gear bag, waterproof matches, energy bars, and, most importantly, a small emergency beacon she always carried during marine research expeditions. The beacon was designed for researchers who might become separated from their boats during deepwater studies. It had a range of nearly 50 miles and would automatically activate if submerged beyond a certain depth. Sarah programmed it with her personal identification code and hid it inside her wetsuit, where it would be virtually undetectable. As she made these preparations, Sarah realized that she was operating under the assumption that Andreas planned to kill her. The rational part of her mind suggested that she might be overreacting, that maybe she had misinterpreted the situation. But her father's voice in her head was clear: in a survival situation, it's better to be wrong about danger than to be surprised by it. Around midnight, Sarah heard Andreas talking on his radio again, this time in English mixed with Greek. She caught enough words to understand that he was coordinating with someone else, discussing timing and locations. Most chillingly, she heard him say, "The problem will be resolved tomorrow morning." Clean and simple. There was no longer any doubt about Andreas's intentions. The only question was whether Sarah could outthink and outmaneuver a man who clearly had experience with making people disappear. She spent the remaining hours until dawn in a state of controlled alertness, dozing lightly while staying aware of any sounds or movements around the boat. Every time Andreas moved around the deck, she tracked his location and activity. She noted when he checked the locked compartment, when he made radio calls, and when he prepared equipment she couldn't identify. Most importantly, she used the time to mentally rehearse every survival scenario her father had ever taught her: escaping from a sinking vessel, surviving in open ocean without flotation, evading pursuit in water, signaling for rescue, fighting underwater. Each scenario required different tactics and priorities, and Sarah ran through them all, preparing for whatever Andreas might attempt. As the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, Sarah realized that this was likely her last peaceful moment for some time. In a few hours, she would either escape this situation or become another person who disappeared mysteriously in the Mediterranean. The difference between those outcomes would depend entirely on how well her father had prepared her for a moment she had always hoped would never come. What Sarah didn't know was that her message had already reached her father, and that Command Master Chief Daniel Martinez had immediately recognized the danger signal. Even as she prepared for whatever Andreas had planned, her father was already making phone calls that would mobilize resources she couldn't imagine. Dawn broke gray and ominous over the Mediterranean, with heavy clouds that matched Sarah's growing sense of dread. She had spent the night in a state of alert readiness, and now As Andreas moved around the boat with obvious purpose, she knew the moment of truth was approaching. The other passengers remained blissfully unaware of the danger. Elena was already up, enthusiastically photographing the dramatic sunrise and making notes about their remote location. Marcus and Linda were preparing their snorkeling gear, excited about Andreas's promise of pristine underwater visibility in these deep waters. Andreas had positioned the boat in a location that Sarah now recognized as strategically perfect for his purposes. They were in deep water, far from any shipping lanes, with the nearest land more than 30 miles away. The sea was calm, but the weather forecast called for increasing winds later in the day, which would make any rescue operations more difficult. Around 8 in the morning, Andreas made an announcement that chilled Sarah to her core. Today we will have a very special experience. I want to show you all something that very few tourists ever see. But first, Sarah, I need you to help me check some equipment in the forward compartment. The request was delivered in front of the other passengers with perfect casualness, but Sarah heard the underlying command. Andreas was moving to isolate her from potential witnesses, and he was doing it in a way that would seem completely normal to Elena and the Thompsons. Of course, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I'd be happy to help. As they walked toward the locked compartment at the front of the boat, Sarah's mind was calculating distances and options. The emergency beacon was secured in her wetsuit, which she was wearing under her clothes. Her diving knife was strapped to her leg, hidden but accessible. Most importantly, her phone had been sending location updates every 15 minutes throughout the night, creating a detailed trail of their movements. Andreas unlocked the compartment with a key he wore around his neck, revealing an interior that looked nothing like the safety equipment storage he had described to passengers. Instead, Sarah saw the waterproof containers from yesterday's transfer, along with communication equipment, weapons, and what appeared to be restraints and other tools that made her stomach clench. You have been very curious about this area of the boat, Andreas said, no longer bothering to maintain his friendly tour guide persona. I think it is time you learned what is really happening here. Sarah forced herself to remain calm as Andreas explained the situation with chilling directness. The tour boat operation was a cover for a sophisticated smuggling network that moved everything from drugs and weapons to people throughout the Mediterranean. The containers held documents and materials for a major operation that would take place within the next few days, involving the movement of high-value individuals who preferred to travel without official documentation. You have seen too much, Andreas continued, his voice matter-of-fact. And you are too smart to pretend you have seen nothing. This creates a problem that must be solved. I'm just a tourist, Sarah protested, playing for time while evaluating her options. I don't understand any of this, and I'm not interested in understanding it. I just want to finish my vacation and go home. Andreas smiled coldly. You are not just a tourist, Sarah Martinez. You are the daughter of a United States Navy SEAL. You have been trained to observe and remember details. You have been taking photographs. And last night, you sent messages to people who would ask inconvenient questions if something happened to you. The revelation that Andreas knew her background and had been monitoring her communications hit Sarah like a physical blow. She realized that she had been walking into a trap that was far more sophisticated than she had imagined. These weren't opportunistic criminals who had stumbled into an unexpected problem. They were professionals who had been planning for exactly this contingency. However, Andreas continued, your background also means that you understand the reality of your situation. You know that you are completely isolated, completely dependent on my cooperation for your survival, and completely outmatched by forces you cannot control. So I am going to offer you a choice. The choice Andreas outlined was simple and horrifying. Sarah could cooperate fully with his plans, which involved her disappearing permanently but peacefully, or she could resist, which would result in the same outcome, but with considerably more suffering. He emphasized that her cooperation would ensure that the other passengers completed their tour safely, while resistance would force him to view them as additional security risks. Your father taught you to be practical, Andreas said. Be practical now. What Andreas didn't know was that Command Master Chief Daniel Martinez had taught his daughter to be practical in ways that went far beyond what most people understood. Sarah's father had drilled into her that in truly desperate situations, the only practical response was to fight with everything you had, because the alternative was to die on your knees. "I need a minute to think about this," Sarah said, buying time while her mind raced through possibilities. "Of course," Andreas replied, "but do not take too long. We have a schedule to maintain." As Andreas turned to examine something in one of the containers, Sarah made her move. Years of combat training kicked in as she drew her diving knife and lunged forward, aiming for the major arteries in Andreas's neck. But Andreas was more alert than she had hoped, and her attack caught him only partially off guard. The knife grazed his shoulder rather than finding its intended target, but it was enough to cause significant bleeding and shock. Andreas stumbled backward, shouting in pain and surprise, while Sarah bolted from the compartment toward the main deck. Her plan was simple but desperate: reach the boat's radio equipment and broadcast a mayday call before Andreas could stop her. Even if he killed her afterward, the distress signal might bring rescue for the other passengers and investigation of Andreas's operation. But Andreas had planned for this contingency as well. As Sarah reached for the radio controls, she discovered that the entire communication system had been disabled. Andreas had systematically removed or destroyed every piece of equipment that could be used to contact the outside world, leaving them completely cut off from any potential rescue. The sound of Andreas's pursuit was getting closer, and Sarah realized that her partial attack had only wounded and enraged him rather than neutralizing the threat. She had seconds to choose her next move, and the options were all desperate. Elena and the Thompsons had heard the commotion and were emerging from the cabin, confused and alarmed by the sight of Sarah wielding a bloody knife and Andreas shouting in Greek while holding his wounded shoulder. The innocent passengers were now potential hostages or casualties, depending on how the situation developed. "Everyone get in the water," Sarah shouted to them. "Jump overboard now." It was a calculated gamble. The water was deep and cold, with the nearest land hours away by swimming. But Sarah had seen enough of Andreas's equipment to know that staying on the boat meant certain death for all of them. In the water, they at least had a chance, especially if her emergency beacon worked as designed. Elena and the Thompsons stared at Sarah in shock, unable to process the sudden transformation of their peaceful vacation into a life-or-death situation. Andreas used their confusion to grab a weapon from the compartment, a modified spear gun that would be lethal at close range. "Nobody moves," Andreas commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority despite his injury. "Everyone stay exactly where you are." But Sarah Martinez was her father's daughter, and she had been trained never to freeze in combat situations. Instead of stopping, she launched herself over the boat's side rail in a diving position that would take her as far from the boat as possible. The cold Mediterranean water hit her like a shock, but Sarah's training took over immediately. She swam underwater for as long as her breath held, putting distance between herself and the boat while staying below the surface where Andreas couldn't target her with his weapon. When she finally surfaced, she was nearly 100 yards from Poseidon's dream, treading water and trying to assess the situation. She could hear Andreas shouting orders, but she couldn't see what was happening to the other passengers. What she could see was that the boat was beginning to move, its engine starting up with a roar that carried clearly across the water. Sarah activated her emergency beacon and began the most challenging swim of her life. She was wearing her wetsuit, which would provide some protection from the cold, but she was also 40 miles from the nearest land in seas that were beginning to roughen as the weather deteriorated. What she didn't know was that Andreas had made a critical mistake in his panic. Instead of pursuing Sarah immediately, he had spent crucial minutes trying to convince the other passengers that she was mentally unstable and dangerous. By the time he realized that letting her escape was an unacceptable security risk, she had already gained too much distance for his weapons to be effective. Andreas now faced a dilemma that would define everything that followed. He could pursue Sarah in the water, but doing so would mean leaving Elena and the Thompsons unattended with access to the boat's remaining equipment. He could kill the other passengers and then pursue Sarah, but their deaths would create additional evidence and complications. Or he could cut his losses and flee immediately, hoping that Sarah would die in the water before she could be rescued. In his anger and panic, Andreas chose the worst possible option from his own perspective. He decided to eliminate Sarah as a threat while keeping the other passengers as potential hostages or witnesses who could support his story about a tragic accident. Andreas turned Poseidon's dream towards Sarah's position and opened the engines to full throttle. His plan was simple: run her down with the boat's hull and claim that her death was an accident that occurred during a rescue attempt after she had suffered a mental breakdown. But Sarah had been watching the boat's movements and recognized the attack for what it was. Drawing on every underwater evasion technique her father had taught her, she dove deep just as the boat's hull passed overhead, the propellers missing her by mere feet. The near miss convinced Sarah that Andreas was completely committed to killing her, and that her only hope for survival was to stay submerged until she was far enough away to surface safely. Using a combination of underwater swimming and surface breathing, she began working her way toward what she hoped was the direction of the nearest shipping lane. What Sarah couldn't see from water level was that her escape and the Mediterranean Sea had become Sarah's entire universe, a vast battlefield where every breath was a victory and every second underwater was borrowed time. For 2 hours, Andreas had been hunting her with the systematic precision of a predator who understood that exhaustion was his greatest ally. Each time she surfaced for air, the roar of Poseidon's dream's engines would grow louder as he adjusted course to intercept her position. Sarah's wetsuit was the only thing keeping her from hypothermia, but even its protection was limited in the increasingly rough seas. The weather forecast Andreas had ignored was proving accurate, with winds building to create choppy waves that made swimming exponentially more difficult. What had started as a calm morning was deteriorating into conditions that would challenge even experienced open-water swimmers. But Sarah Martinez was not just an experienced swimmer. She was the product of 28 years of training by one of the most elite military units in the world. Her father had prepared her for exactly this situation, though neither of them had ever imagined she would need to use those skills while being hunted by a boat in the middle of the Mediterranean. The key to underwater evasion, Daniel Martinez had taught his daughter, was not just physical endurance, but strategic thinking. Andreas had several advantages: fuel, speed, and the ability to track her general position from his elevated position on the boat. But he also had critical disadvantages that Sarah could exploit if she remained calm and methodical. The most important advantage Sarah possessed was Andreas's growing desperation. Each minute he spent hunting her was another minute for potential rescue operations to mobilize. Each pass he made with the boat was using fuel he couldn't replace. Most critically, each attempt to ram her was creating evidence of intentional homicide that would be difficult to explain to authorities. Andreas was also making tactical mistakes born of anger and panic. Instead of using the boat's speed to establish a search pattern that would eventually corner Sarah in a limited area, he was chasing her reactively, responding to her movements rather than predicting them. This gave Sarah the initiative, allowing her to control the pace and direction of the encounter. Sarah began implementing her father's advanced evasion strategies. Instead of swimming directly away from the boat, she started using erratic underwater movements that would confuse Andreas's ability to predict her surfacing locations. She would dive in one direction, swim underwater in a different direction, surface briefly for air, then immediately dive again at an unexpected angle. The technique was exhausting, but it was working. Andreas's attempts to ram her were becoming less accurate as he struggled to anticipate her movements. More importantly, his increasingly frustrated radio calls suggested that he was running behind schedule for whatever operation the smuggled containers were supporting. But Sarah knew she couldn't maintain this level of exertion indefinitely. The cold water was sapping her strength with every passing minute, and the growing waves were making it harder to grab quick breaths between dives. She needed to either find a way to neutralize Andreas as a threat or somehow signal her position to potential risk. Andreas's pursuit had been observed by Elena Rossetti, who was not the innocent art historian she had pretended to be. Elena was actually an undercover investigator for Interpol, tracking the same smuggling network that Andreas worked for. She had joined the tour specifically to gather evidence about Andreas's operations, but Sarah's presence had accelerated everything beyond her control. As Andreas continued his deadly game of cat and mouse with Sarah in the water, Elena made a decision that would change everything. Using communication equipment hidden in her luggage, she began broadcasting on emergency frequencies, reporting their exact position and requesting immediate assistance from any vessels in the area. But help was still hours away, and Sarah was alone in increasingly rough seas with a determined killer hunting her. The emergency beacon was transmitting her location, but whether anyone would receive the signal in time remained to be seen. What no one aboard Poseidon's Dream knew was that Sarah's message from the previous night had already triggered a response that was moving across the Mediterranean faster than any conventional rescue operation. Command Master Chief Daniel Martinez and his former team had resources that civilian authorities couldn't imagine, and they were already closing on the boat's last known position. The question was whether Sarah could survive long enough for help to arrive. And as Andreas made another pass with the boat, forcing her to dive again as the hull thundered overhead, Sarah realized that her father's training was about to face its ultimate test. The SEALs had a saying, "We don't leave anyone behind." Sarah was about to discover that retirement didn't change that commitment, and that some bonds are stronger than any criminal organization could understand. But first, she had to survive what Andreas had planned for the morning. And as she watched him emerge from the pilot station with a grim expression and purposeful movements, Sarah knew that her survival training was about to be tested in the most literal way possible. The vacation was over. Now it was war. Tane supplementing his income with occasional smuggling. He was a key link in a sophisticated human trafficking network that moved people, drugs, and weapons throughout the Mediterranean. The containers she had witnessed being transferred contained documents, cash, and coordination materials for an operation that had taken months to organize. More importantly, the men who had delivered those containers weren't just criminals. They were part of an organization with connections to terrorist groups operating throughout southern Europe and North Africa. The cargo they had transferred was destined for a much larger operation, and Sarah Martinez had just become a witness to a critical piece of international criminal infrastructure. As the catamaran's engine started and they began moving toward their next destination, Sarah realized that her morning swim had just made her the most dangerous passenger Andreas had ever carried. The question was no longer whether she would see something she shouldn't. The question was whether Andreas could afford to let her live to tell anyone about what she had already seen. Standing in the cabin doorway, listening to Andreas continue his radio conversation, Sarah made a decision that would define everything that followed. She would not go quietly. She would not disappear without a fight. And if something happened to her, she would make sure there was enough evidence left behind to bring justice to her father and everyone else she cared about. She had no way of knowing that within hours, her resolve would be tested in ways that would require every skill her SEAL father had ever taught her. She also had no way of knowing that her disappearance would trigger a response that would reach far beyond anything Andreas and his associates could imagine. The game had changed, but Sarah Martinez was her father's daughter, and that meant she was far from defenseless. The SEALs away forever.